Hey guys, welcome back to another week of me reviewing the news, and the economic topics that are of interest for this week are going to be reparations, recession, taxes, and OPEC. And if you're new to this channel, welcome to Coffee Economics. My name is Abe. Without further ado, let's get into the news and see what we can learn from it this week. So Tunisia is having debt issues like many other African countries at the moment. And one of the things that Tunisia is trying to grapple with is whether it should get this loan from the IMF for $2 billion or do its own way of getting the money to pay its debts or to keep in line with its debt repayments. So Tunisia's president has decided it's going to raise taxes on the rich. Why? Because the IMF has said that one way they could help them out with their debt problem is that they would give them a $2 billion loan if they go about doing some economic readjustments. And what that means is getting rid of subsidies and the like. So I've got a video on subsidies where I talk about the pros and cons of subsidies. One of the things that is plaguing many African countries, how do you support a still developing economy? If you remove these subsidies, what can happen is that people don't consume enough of that good or service, and that can make the economy slow down. What the IMF is sort of suggesting is that if they remove the subsidies, it means that they can be more efficient because they'll spend money on other things rather than supporting whatever programs that the Tunisian government is supporting. So the president said, no, we're not doing that. We're going to tax the rich because they benefit from those subsidies, but they don't really need them. So that's how we're going to solve our problem. And I think this is a really great plan from the Tunisian president. He's just not letting the IMF just dictate to him what they should do. As you can see here in one of his comments is that the state will not submit to foreign dictates. So really they're standing up for themselves because it's a conditional loan that the IMF is going to give. They'll grant them a loan to Tunisia, conditional on economic reform. So it's an interesting one because one of the things that they want to also for them to restructure is that they want them to get privatized, I believe, many of those public companies that the state owns, which is an interesting topic in itself about privatization. I'm still doing some research on that because I want to put out a video for you guys that talks about the pros and cons of subsidization, of privatization, why some people say you should privatize and why some people say you should not. And it's a very interesting concept. What it tends to come down to is how the privatization is done. If you don't have the right systems and the right way of tendering the privatization, it can probably lead to worse outcomes or to worse things than if the thing is within the government's control. So it's not always a clear-cut case that, if you privatize, you get better outcomes. And I'll explore that more in a video later as I build this channel. We'll keep a watch on this space and see how this pans out, whether the Tunisian government sticks with its plan to tax the rich and how that goes down. It could work because if they tax the rich, who knows? Maybe they'll say, oh, no, we don't want to live in Tunisia. We'll go because they're taxing us a bit more. But at least it's for them politically, it's probably the best move because they seem to be supporting the poor rather than just, folding and making the poor worse off by getting rid of some subsidies and some other programs which support the country, which is struggling with chronic food shortages and also issues around their debts being too high. So interesting one to see. We'll see how that goes. This is a short one, a quick one coming out of South Africa. So right now South Africa just recently raised their interest rates to 8.25%, I believe, their interest rates to tame inflation. And in a previous video, I talked about that and I showed that South Africa is sort of on the downward trajectory with that inflation, so that monetary policy is working. So interest rates, if you raise them, they cause people to save money, not to spend it as much as they would if interest rates were low, and which it causes the demand for goods to slow down, which causes the prices of goods to come down. So that's how that sort of dynamic works. One of the fallouts or the issues with that strategy is that as the central bank tries to reduce inflation, it slows down the economy and then the economy can go into what's called a recession. So a recession is simply that the economy does not grow but goes backwards. So there's negative growth. So instead of a positive number of growth compared to probably last quarter or last year, same quarter, you get a negative a negative number. There's different definitions of recession. Some say it's 2 quarters of negative growth. This is good news for South Africa that they managed to stay positive. It's a very slight positive of 0.4%. And really what's been driving them is, so the mining sector has done really well. And this is a surprise to some of the analysts because South Africa as well has been struggling with the rolling blackouts that are happening with the energy sector. So they've somehow managed to pull this off. But to add to this as well, when people come up with these statistics, it's usually there's a lag. So this is data based on maybe a few months ago, but it might not be reflective of what's the reality now. Potentially South Africa right now is in recession, potentially they're not. So at the moment, this data shows a rear view picture of what's going on, whether South Africa is still, the economy is still growing or it's not. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next quarter. Hopefully, if they can tame inflation quickly and get it to their target rate of between 3 and 6%, they can start focusing on economic growth rather than trying to slow down inflation. So we'll keep our eyes on this and yeah, we'll see how this goes. So the next story that I want to talk about is OPEC. So OPEC is an organization that brings together all the oil many of the oil producing nations together. They are kind of like a monopoly. So what they do is that they decide how much oil is going to be produced in total globally. By doing that, they set the prices. So what happens if a monopoly decides this is how much we're going to produce, but there's so much demand, they can control prices through that way. So if they artificially reduce demand, what happens is that price can increase because more people want that good, causing the price to rise. OPEC has cut the production of oil, and that's going to start in January 2024 with that aim of keeping prices high, because right now prices have been dropping for oil. The amount of oil production will go down in many of the oil producing nations like Nigeria and Angola and the like. This can be a good and bad strategy for one. One of the ways it can sort of work out for them is that prices can go up, and it can help countries like Nigeria, Angola make sure that they've got enough money being generated by the exports to support the economy, because they're selling less, but they're selling it at a higher price. The bad side about this is that if they produce to that quota at a reduced quota, but prices keep going down further, is that if they do not forecast that correctly, but the prices crash even further, those countries can end up being in a budget black hole where the oil is not generating enough money to fund their budgets for things like, social security programs and the like. So it'll be interesting to see what the impacts will be for the oil producing nations. It's not clear cut how it'll go. This quota is a voluntary quota, which is one of the most important things I probably should have said earlier, that you are not forced to cut your production if you don't want to, but you kind of look like a jerk if you don't. So it's kind of like one of those things where it's like groupthink, or where the group sort of moves together. We all, like all those people who are part of OPEC, kind of move together, even if generally people might not want to do that, but they've come to a consensus that they will. We'll see what happens in the next few months and see how the oil price will change. So the next story I'm going to talk about is really an interesting one for those who are really interested in reparations, particularly reparations within an African context. California has put a price on what it might be to pay people for the injustice that they experienced due to slavery. How they've put a price on it, this is really interesting as an economist, how people put price on things like this. I'm going to try and make a video about that, because it's really interesting how people put a price on things like human life, the environment, and all that sort of stuff. Those are interesting topics and sometimes quite controversial. What this committee or group have found is that they've come up with a number, and that number is that they would need to pay $1.2 million per person for the injustice of slavery. For you, it might be a big number, a small number, given the impacts over generations that have happened. But it's a really big step in that America is moving forward in terms of trying to sort of rectify this issue about compensating people for the injustice that they've experienced, even though it's not them that have directly been affected by slavery, but because of what happened to the ancestors, they're affected till today. Of course, there's going to be questions about how do you identify those who have been affected by slavery, and how will they even get this money. So it's $1.2 million per person, and they estimate that it will cost about $800 billion to compensate all those who were affected by slavery within the state of California. So there's not broader America, but it's sort of starting a conversation about how much how much do people deserve to be compensated for the effects of slavery and other racial discriminatory laws and policies that have been enacted in the past. Backstory is that it got started because of it came out. This commission was commissioned after the murder of George Floyd in 2020. So it's only taken 2 years for this to kind of turn around, which is quite fast if you think about it, because this has been something that has been talked about and mentioned many times, but no one has really done really much, and there hasn't been any movement from what I know, is that this is probably the most major work that is done at actually putting a number on what it would mean to compensate people for the impacts of slavery. So it will be interesting to see what happens, because there's a bit of support from African Americans, of course, but there's not so much support from quite a few groups. For example, the white people who support reparations is still quite low from those who are white. Even the Hispanic and the Asians don't have much support for it. Those who are Republican really don't support doing reparations, whereas those who are Democrat is kind of half and half. As we know, Zimbabwe is also exploring this topic of reparations, as are many other African countries and many other Pan-African people, about colonization, that Africans should be compensated for the injustice of colonization. And this could be a blueprint for many people for other countries to look at and see it as a way of calculating how much should colonizers pay Africans for the injustice of colonization. Whether we actually get paid for it is another question, because it needs political power to do that, and also there needs to be a strong united voice not just from Africans but from European and Western allies from countries that did impose colonization on Africa, for this to even become a reality of Africans being paid for the impacts of colonization on their ancestors and on themselves, if they're still alive today, those who have been directly impacted by colonization, and the impacts of future generations so far. So I think this will be an interesting space to keep looking at. I think some people there might be some people who take this on and sort of build a model and come up with a number for how much each African should be paid for colonization within the context of that African country. Like South Africa's number would be different from Zimbabwe's, and that would be different from Nigeria's, and that would be different from all the other different African countries that experience colonization. This is an interesting one. This is a one that has really captured my imagination about how they've calculated this, and I'll be looking into this more and watching this space to see what happens. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video and this breakdown of the news articles of this week. I'll see you guys in my next video coming up next week. And if you like this episode, make sure to hit my link on buy me a coffee. And if you like, please support me. Otherwise, make sure to hit the subscribe button and the like button if you like this video today. And I'll catch you guys in my next video. Bye.